But before we plunge into the disturbing tales of the night, let me ask you, do you have the courage to stay until the end? Most who watch don't subscribe to the channel, perhaps out of simple oversight, or perhaps because, after hearing these stories, they never slept the same way again. If you think you can handle it, click subscribe now. My name is Father Jonathan, and for years I've served as a priest in Chicago. I've always been skeptical of ghost stories and supernatural manifestations until the night I was called to help a distressed family. They reached out to me after strange events at Black Hollow Cemetery, where a relative of theirs had been recently buried. They reported screams during the night, whispers coming from the grave, and a terrifying feeling of being watched. Skeptical but desperate, they asked me to bless the site. Despite my disbelief, I accepted. It was my duty to bring comfort to the living and rest to the dead. I arrived at the cemetery around 11 at night. The place was shrouded in a dense fog, and the wind cut like razors. The darkness seemed alive, stretching between the time-worn tombstones. As I walked through the cemetery with my flickering lantern, a sound stopped me in my tracks. A weeping, low at first, almost indistinct, but it soon became distressing, agonizing. A cry of despair that echoed through the place, as if something was calling for help from the depths of the earth. I wanted to believe it was the wind, but the sound was human. It was a plea. I approached the grave indicated by the family and knelt to begin my prayers. But as I recited the sacred words, the weeping transformed into visceral screams, as if someone was being torn apart. That's when I felt it. Icy hands touched my neck. They squeezed sharp as invisible claws. A crushing pressure overwhelmed me. My prayers caught in my throat as an unseen force tried to suffocate me. I struggled, trying to recite verses from the Bible, but my body was locked. Despair washed over me as I felt something whispering against my skin. "You shouldn't be here." Suddenly, the hands vanished. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating. I stood up, trembling, cold sweat running down my back. I wanted to run, but one last look at the grave made me freeze. The earth was disturbed, as if something had moved inside. The lamppost lights flickered, and for a second, I saw it. A shadow crawling out of the grave. My name is Father Matthew, and I have been a priest for over 20 years. I have performed countless blessings, exorcisms, and funeral ceremonies, but nothing compares to what I experienced at Ravenswood Cemetery in rural Illinois. I was called by a family who reported hearing the sounds of Latin prayers echoing through the cemetery in the early hours of the morning. At first, I thought they might be monks or devout individuals praying, but the family insisted the chants were coming from underground. Being a man of faith and balanced skepticism, I agreed to investigate. I arrived at the cemetery at dusk. The place was old, its tombstones covered in moss and cracked by time. The fog crawled like spectral fingers across the dry grass. The family led me to a forgotten section of the cemetery, where the graves were so old that the names had been erased by time. I waited until night fell completely. The temperature plummeted abnormally, and the silence became deafening. That's when the voices began, low, indistinct, like a choir whispering an ancient prayer. The Latin was recognizable, but the words were twisted, disjointed, as if someone was trying to remember a forgotten prayer. I walked towards the most deteriorated tomb, the epicenter of the chants. With the lantern trembling in my hand, I began my own prayer. But then, the voices changed. What was once a calm prayer became an urgent lament. "Help us." The phrase was repeated by dozens of voices at the same time, some desperate, others enraged. The ground beneath my feet trembled slightly. My lantern flickered, and then I saw it. A hand emerging from the ground, pale, skeletal, the fingers twitching unnaturally. Reeling back, my voice failed. But before I could react, an entire body emerged from the earth. It wasn't an ordinary corpse. Its clothes were still intact, but its face was a black void. Others began to emerge around me. A procession of restless dead, their mouths moving without emitting sound. Their eyes, where they should have been, were just deep, empty holes. They shuffled towards me, some raising their arms in supplication, others grinding their teeth as if they wanted to drag me down into the earth with them. Desperate, I raised my crucifix and prayed. My voice mingled with the chants, and one by one the dead stopped. For an instant they stood still. Then, as if an invisible force were pulling them, they were sucked back into the earth, disappearing in seconds. Only one remained, the first one I saw. He pointed a bony finger at me and whispered something in slurred Latin. The only word I understood was, "They will return." And then he sank into the ground, as if he had never been there. I'm Bishop Adrian, and for many years I served in a diocese in South Carolina. My work has always led me to deal with the spiritual and the unexplainable, but nothing could have prepared me for the night I spent in Charleston Cemetery. I was sent to bless the land after several reports from parishioners indicated that something restless was wandering there. People reported whispers in Latin, shadows moving between the tombstones, and an oppressive feeling as if the cemetery itself rejected the living. I decided to go alone, believing that a simple prayer would solve everything. I was terribly wrong. Shadows among the graves. I arrived at the cemetery shortly after 10 at night. The place was a relic of the 17th century, its statues and tombstones covered in moss, as if nature itself was trying to forget that place. The silence was sepulchral. I knelt before a large stone cross in the center of the cemetery and began my prayer. At first, everything seemed peaceful, but then I heard footsteps. They were soft but constant. I looked around, and there was no one there. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the prayer until a sound chilled my blood. "Help us." The voice was not human. It was hoarse, whispering, fragmented, as if spoken by several mouths at the same time. When I raised my lantern, the shadows began to move. Dark figures crawled between the graves, their forms distorted and flickering, as if they did not completely belong to this world. Then, one of them stepped forward. It was an old-looking man, dressed in clerical attire, but his face, he had no eyes, just two black sockets that seemed to devour the light. He pointed to a tomb next to him and whispered, "Free him." With a lump in my throat, I turned the lantern to where he was pointing and saw a broken tombstone. The name was illegible, but around it were strange markings engraved in the stone, symbols that I had never seen before. I felt something wrapping around my ankle. Looking down, I saw fingers coming out of the earth, trying to pull me down. My mind panicked. I shouldn't be there. I shouted the prayers of exorcism loudly and raised my crucifix. The eyeless shadow screamed, an agonizing sound, and the fingers around me crumbled to dust. The other shadows retreated, being sucked back into the graves. But before disappearing, the eyeless figure said one last sentence. "He still does not sleep." Then everything was silent again. I ran out of there. The next morning, I returned with a group of priests for a purification ceremony. When we dug up the tomb, indicated by the shadow, we found a coffin sealed with iron chains. We didn't have the courage to open it. We just sealed the cemetery with blessings and walked away, knowing that some things must remain buried. My name is Father Jonathan, and for years I've performed blessing rituals in places where the dead cannot find rest. I've never considered myself an easily impressed man, until the night I witnessed the procession of the dead at Gloria Hills Cemetery in Savannah, Georgia. For decades, parishioners have reported strange figures marching silently among the graves, always at midnight. Voices whisper prayers in ancient languages, and golden lights dance in the darkness. Reports of something even more disturbing said that anyone who watched the procession for too long would disappear without a trace. I thought it was just local folklore, but I was terribly wrong. I arrived at Gloria Hills around 11 at night, armed only with a lantern, a crucifix, and my faith. The fog was thick, and the old tombstones emerged from it as if they were trying to escape the ground. The silence was absolute. As I approached the abandoned chapel where the procession supposedly began, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh footprints in the dirt ground, small and deep, as if a crowd had passed through there just moments ago. My breathing became heavy. That's when I heard it, the murmuring. At first it sounded like a distant wind, but as it approached, the words became clearer. They were voices praying in Latin. I hid behind a mausoleum and watched. Among the shadows, small golden lights began to emerge. First one, then two, then dozens of them, moving in a line, snaking through the cemetery like a spectral court. They were human figures, but something was wrong. Their faces were empty. Where their eyes and mouths should have been, there was only an endless black hole. They carried candles, and their steps made no sound at all. Then I saw her. At the front of the procession, a woman in a black veil walked slowly, holding a rosary made of bones. She turned her head and looked directly at me, and that's when everything fell apart. I felt a crushing pressure on my bones. It was as if the earth itself was trying to pull me down. My vision blurred, and my lantern flickered violently. The woman raised her hand and pointed at me. Her empty eyes began to bleed, and her mouth opened slowly into an inaudible whisper. I tried to scream, but I couldn't make any sound. Then I heard a single phrase spoken in my mind. "Join us." My body began to cool. My feet were sinking into the ground, as if invisible hands were pulling me in. That's when my faith spoke louder. I held up my crucifix and began to pray aloud, shouting each word. The procession stopped. The woman in the black veil recoiled slightly. The earth around me stopped pulling me. Without hesitation, I turned and ran. I ran like never before, ignoring the murmurs and whispers that tried to call me back. The light of my lantern trembled as I ran through the maze of tombs, but I didn't look back. I knew that if I looked, I wouldn't escape. When I finally reached the gates of the cemetery, I stumbled and fell to my knees. Behind me, the fog consumed the figures, and the golden lights went out one by one. The silence returned, but before disappearing completely, I heard one last whisper coming from the darkness. "Next time, don't run." I never returned to Gloria Hill Cemetery, but every full moon night when the clock strikes midnight, I feel something, a weight in my chest, a distant whisper, and sometimes, when I'm alone, I see a golden light flickering in the darkness, waiting for me. My name is Father Benjamin, and this story happened when I was called to investigate strange occurrences at St. Mark's Cemetery in New Orleans, Louisiana. Since its construction in the 19th century, the cemetery has accumulated countless legends and reports of apparitions, but one of the most persistent was about a cursed mausoleum. The cemetery caretaker, a man named Wallace, was terrified. He told me that in the last few weeks, always at midnight, the mausoleum door would open on its own, and on some nights he would see a human shadow coming out of it, standing there, motionless, as if waiting for something. I went to St. Mark's that night, determined to discover the truth. The moon was hidden by heavy clouds, and the wind carried the smell of wet earth and dead leaves. The cemetery was deserted, except for Wallace, who led me to the mausoleum. The structure was old and covered in moss, with an iron door ajar, creaking slowly in the wind. "See, I locked that door last night. It shouldn't be open." My stomach churned. I held up my crucifix and went inside. The smell of dampness and decay was suffocating. Stone walls were lined with marble plaques, each engraved with the names of people buried there over a century ago. As I illuminated the floor with my lantern, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the dust, newly formed, and they weren't Wallace's. My breathing became heavy. That's when we heard it, a deep, icy whisper coming from the depths of the mausoleum. "You shouldn't be here." Wallace ran off without looking back. I was alone, and then the door slammed shut behind me. The air turned frigid, and my lantern flickered violently. I heard slow, dragging footsteps coming from the darkness. I raised my lantern and saw it, a shadow moving among the crypts, but this shadow had no body. It moved like living smoke, changing shape every second. Then it stopped and turned to me. My muscles locked when I realized. It had no face, just a black hole where the eyes and mouth should have been. And then it started walking towards me, slowly, methodically. And when it tried to speak again, its voice was that of several people at the same time, in a distorted chorus. "Help us, free us, or join us." My legs finally reacted, and I ran. The mausoleum was a maze of narrow corridors, and the shadow slid quickly behind me, closing off all exits. It was whispering my name now. I knew that if I stopped, it would be the end. My fingers touched my crucifix, and I began to pray aloud. "Lord, deliver me from evil." The shadow trembled, as if it had been struck by something invisible. The iron door behind me opened on its own, and I ran outside, feeling the fresh night air surround me again. When I turned to look, the mausoleum was silent, no movement, no shadow, just the iron door closed again, as if it had never been opened. The next day, I found Wallace and told him everything. He turned pale and revealed something that made me shudder. "Father, over 100 years ago, 12 people were buried alive in that mausoleum. They say their souls have never found peace." Since that night, I have never returned to St. Mark's Cemetery. But on some early mornings, I wake up with a suffocating feeling, as if something is still watching me. And sometimes when I pass through deserted streets, I see a faceless shadow reflected in shop windows and mirrors, always standing still, always waiting. My name is Father Samuel, and what I experienced at Blackwood Cemetery in Georgia haunts me to this day. The cemetery, founded in the late 18th century, has a macabre reputation. Since ancient times, locals have reported seeing lights floating between the graves and hearing whispers in Latin at nightfall. But what terrified me the most were the reports of a procession of the dead marching along the cobblestone road, always at midnight. I didn't believe those stories until I saw it with my own eyes. I received a request from a small group of parishioners. They were worried because strange figures had been seen near the oldest tombs. I went to Blackwood Cemetery alone shortly before midnight. The sky was cloudy without a moon, and a fog crept across the ground as if the cemetery itself were breathing. The silence there was supernatural. No sound of crickets, no wind, only the echo of my own footsteps on the damp earth. I walked towards the abandoned chapel, one of the oldest points in the cemetery. That's when I heard the first sound, a whisper, low, almost imperceptible, and then footsteps, many footsteps, echoing down the cobblestone road, coming from all sides. My blood ran cold. When I raised my lantern, I saw something I will never forget. A cortege of dark figures walking in perfect synchronicity. Each held a flickering candle, its flames wavering without any wind. Their faces were blurred, as if time had erased their features, but their eyes, they were empty, pure shadows. The procession didn't seem to notice me, so I hid behind a tombstone and watched in absolute silence. They walked slowly, as if they were trapped in an endless cycle. When the first in line passed before me, I could clearly hear what they were murmuring, "Remember us, remember us." Suddenly, one of the figures stopped and slowly turned its head towards me. My heart leaped into my throat. The others continued marching, but this figure remained motionless, staring at me. Then it raised its hand and pointed to the ground next to the chapel. Terror overwhelmed me, but something inside me compelled me to look. With the lantern trembling in my hands, I illuminated the place it was pointing to. And then I saw it. The ground was sunken as if someone had recently tried to dig there. And among the disturbed earth, there were broken human bones and pieces of rotten wood. A grave, but there was no tombstone. Someone was buried there without a name, without a dignified rest. I returned my eyes to the figure that was watching me. It was still pointing at the grave, as if asking for something. At that moment, I understood. They were not vengeful spirits. They were forgotten souls, trapped in an eternal loop because no one had ever prayed for them. I closed my eyes and began to pray. My voice trembled, but I continued, asking God to guide them to rest. And then, silence. I opened my eyes and the procession had disappeared. The cobblestone road was empty, as if nothing had happened. Only a single candle remained lit, floating in the dark. When I left the cemetery that night, I felt a weight dissipating from the air. And since then, they have never reported the March of the Dead at Blackwood Cemetery again. But sometimes I still dream of those empty eyes watching me, waiting. My name is Father Richard, and a few years ago I experienced something that made me question the nature of evil. I was called to investigate paranormal events at Ravenswood Cemetery, located on the outskirts of New Orleans. The caretakers reported footsteps echoing in the empty corridors, whispers in the wind, and a black silhouette that remained motionless at the entrance to an abandoned mausoleum. At first, I thought they were just local superstitions, until I entered that mausoleum. I arrived at Ravenswood Cemetery shortly before midnight. The hot wind blew through the old tombstones, making the old trees creak as if they were whispering secrets. The iron gates were slightly open, swaying gently, emitting a low and disturbing creak. I entered. The cemetery was too silent. Not the sound of a cricket, not the flapping of a crow's wings. It was as if the place itself were holding its breath. With my lantern trembling in my hand, I followed the stone path that led to the mausoleum. Then I heard the first sound, a dull thud, as if something heavy had been dragged inside the mausoleum. Upon reaching the entrance of the mausoleum, I felt an intense chill, as if the very air was impregnated with dark energy. My lantern illuminated the heavy iron doors, now ajar. I hesitated, and then I heard the whisper, low, hoarse, coming from within. "Why did you come?" My heart leaped into my throat. The voice seemed very close, but the interior was completely empty. Holding my crucifix tightly, I entered the mausoleum. The temperature dropped drastically, and my hands turned icy. The light of the lantern revealed the walls covered with strange inscriptions, symbols I did not recognize. And in the center of the mausoleum, I saw a single, nameless tombstone. The earth around it was disturbed, as if someone had tried to dig. Then the shadows began to move. A sudden movement in the corner of my eye made my blood run cold. Something rose from the darkness, a tall, hunched silhouette, without a face, but with red eyes shining in the void. Its presence made the air heavy, suffocating. Every instinct inside me screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure approached, gliding across the floor without making a sound. Then in a deep and distorted voice, it spoke. "He locked me in here, but I still wait." My bones trembled. This was no ordinary spirit. It was something trapped, something ancient, and I didn't want to find out what would happen if it were released. My instinct screamed to run, and this time my body obeyed. I bolted through the mausoleum, hearing the whispers turn into screams behind me. The instant I crossed the gates of the cemetery, the wind stopped abruptly. Everything went silent again. But then, in the middle of the road, a detail made my blood run cold. The mausoleum gate, which I had left open, was locked again, and engraved on the wood with deep scratches, there was a single phrase: "He will return." Since that night, I have never set foot in Ravenswood Cemetery again, but sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still hear that voice whispering in the dark. My name is Father Thomas, and I have witnessed many unexplainable things throughout my life. But nothing prepared me for what happened at Crestwood Cemetery, located on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Residents reported hearing children's laughter in the middle of the night, invisible games and small shadows running between the tombstones. I was called to investigate, but I didn't expect to find something much worse. I arrived at Crestwood Cemetery around 9 at night, accompanied by a young assistant named David. The place was silent, enveloped by a thin fog that crawled across the ground like spectral fingers. The wind blew low and steady, carrying with it distant whispers that seemed to blend into the silence. As we passed through the twisted iron gates, I noticed something strange. The angels sculpted on the tombstones were turned to the other side, as if they didn't want to look at that place. It made my stomach churn. We walked along the stone path, illuminating the ground with our lanterns. That's when we heard it for the first time. The laughter. It was low, childish, but wrong. As if something was trying to imitate the sound of a happy child, but without exactly understanding how human laughter worked. David looked at me, nervous. "Father, this doesn't feel right." I agreed, but kept walking. The laughter came again. This time, louder. And it wasn't alone. Several voices began to laugh at the same time, coming from all sides. We turned a corner and found something disturbing. There were small footprints, like those of children, scattered across a stretch of freshly turned earth. But what chilled me wasn't the footprints themselves. They were too deep, as if those children hadn't simply walked there, but had come out of the earth. The laughter grew louder, and then turned into screams. The lanterns flickered violently, and that's when we saw them. Small shadows ran between the tombstones, moving too fast to be normal. They were children, but not exactly. Their eyes didn't reflect the light of the lantern. Their faces were partially distorted, as if they were old portraits burned around the edges, and they all stopped suddenly, looking directly at us. "Father?" David held my arm, trembling. Then one of them spoke, in a low, suffocated voice that seemed to come from underwater. "Play with us?" Before I could answer, the ground trembled beneath our feet. The children began to walk in a circle around us, small shadows spinning too fast. Their eyes glowed with a dull, sick hue, and their laughter mingled with the screams. "Play with us!" The tombstones trembled, as if the cemetery itself rejected our presence. David collapsed to his knees, holding his head. And that's when I understood. They were trying to pull us inside, not for a game, but to where they were. With all my strength, I pulled David away and we started running. The children screamed in fury, their voices distorted and echoing through the wind. The cemetery gate seemed farther and farther away, as if the place itself were holding us back. But we managed. As soon as we crossed the gates, the laughter stopped immediately. The silence returned. We turned to look one last time. The children were still there, but now they were motionless, looking at us, with their heads slightly tilted, and a smile that shouldn't have been there. My name is Bishop Vincent, and for years I have served in the Diocese of Savannah, Georgia. I have witnessed unexplainable things throughout my life. But nothing compares to what I witnessed in the crypt of St. Joseph, a place where time itself seemed distorted. I was called by a group of caretakers who reported whispers coming from inside the crypt. shadows that moved on their own, and a name called in the dark. Their name. I went to investigate, and I almost didn't get out alive. I arrived at St. Joseph's Cemetery a little before midnight, accompanied by 2 acolytes who insisted on coming with me. The entrance to the crypt was at the back of the cemetery, hidden by an old stone staircase that led to an iron door. The lock was rusted, but curiously unlocked. When I pushed it open, the frigid air hit me immediately. It was a different cold, one that didn't come from the weather, but from the presence of something inside. The tunnels of the crypt were narrow and claustrophobic, illuminated only by our lanterns. We walked through a long corridor where rows of burial niches were piled up to the ceiling. The tombs were ancient, some without identification, and that's when we heard it, a whisper, deep and stifled. The sound came from the depths of the crypt, a dragging, distorted echo, and then it said a name. Vincent. The blood froze in my veins. The acolytes looked at each other in panic, but I gestured for us to continue. I knew that if we stopped now, it would get closer. At the end of the corridor, we found a larger chamber, where a stone altar was covered in dust. Something was carved into it, but the words were scratched out, erased, as if someone was trying to prevent them from being read. And on the floor, there were footprints in the dust, footprints that came from the altar and followed until where we were. Then everything went dark. The lantern light flickered violently, and that's when we saw it. In the corner of the chamber, a grotesque shadow rose from the floor like a pool of living darkness. It had a human shape, but it wasn't made of flesh and bone. It was pure emptiness, pure oblivion. The thing moved in an impossible way. Its feet didn't touch the ground, and even without eyes, it was looking at me. And then it spoke again. Vincent, you also belong to this place. I clutched the crucifix, and the shadow smiled. I will never forget that smile, because there was no mouth there. But even so, I knew it was smiling. The acolytes screamed, trying to run, but the shadow moved in front of us, blocking the exit. The tunnel seemed to close around us, as if the crypt itself was pulling us inside it. I shouted the words of the blessing, raising my cross. The shadow hesitated for a second, and then it screamed back. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of something that should never exist. The crypt trembled violently, and we took advantage of it to run. The corridor seemed longer now, as if the exit was moving away. But in the last instant, the iron door appeared before us. I threw myself against it with all my strength, and when we got out, the crypt closed on its own. Silence fell, and the shadow disappeared.